It was just over a year or so ago that a group of 25 of us or so kind of stepped out with this crazy idea of doing church a little bit different. Back on kind of the belief that church ultimately wasn't a building or a day of the week or an event, but the belief that church ultimately is a people. It's a people committed to doing life a little bit different, to find God in the day-to-day, to use our gifts, abilities, passions, stories, circles of influence, to make this place look a little bit more like heaven. And the belief that we weren't meant to do that alone, that the life of faith is a life that's meant to be done in community. And that's some of the reasons that we do some of the things that we do around here. Our service starts at 9:30, but we don't really start things until 9:45. Because that 15 minutes where we're connecting and catching up, we'd say that's church too. And it's one of the reasons that we, like Trista had mentioned, have built small groups into the framework of what we do. Because we all need people that we can call when things are when things are hard. We need people that can know us and lead us and that we can serve and be served. And that's kind of why we do what we do. And I got to kind of experience this just last weekend. A group of us went on a retreat down to Table Rock Lake for the weekend with some of our small group leaders, and we just had a blast, just doing life together, eating meals together, laughing together, playing together, and doing ridiculous things together. I think it was, if you guys remember, last weekend was about as cold as this weekend. It was absolutely freezing. It snowed on our way down there. It felt like a little mini blizzard, first snow of the year. But as soon as we got there, Jeremy, one of our leaders, started joking around about doing a polar plunge. If you know me, I hate the cold. Just hate being cold. I get cold thinking about being cold. I get cold just being inside. But I was like, there's no way. Fast forward Saturday night, we're staying up just very late, and the joking gets more serious. Jeremy starts putting on his swim trunks, and next thing I know, we are walking down to the lake at midnight, 17 degrees, to do a polar plunge. And just to walk down, it's pitch black. Everybody's got their little iPhone lights out, trying to make sense of the terrain. It's absolutely dark. We're tripping into stuff when we make our way down. And as I'm wading slowly into the water, Jeremy comes just running, plodding into the water like a labradoodle, completely covered head to toe. And I've got that moment of crisis where do I go under? Do I go all in? And I dive right in. Freezing, so cold. Would not recommend doing a polar plunge. I was so cold just walking down that I couldn't shiver anymore. I was just clenched teeth the entire time. But this last week I was thinking about that walk down to the lake that night. Just how challenging it was to navigate that terrain when it was pitch black. There was a part of the trail that we thought was a trail, but several people fell into just a pile of leaves. It was 2 to 3 feet of leaves. People were tripping over rocks, running into stuff. When it's dark, it's hard to see where you're going. You bump into things. Does anyone do this at home? Does anyone try and navigate your house with your eyes closed? Am I the only person who's ever tried that? Do you know what I mean? You walk around your house, you think you know where everything is. You're just anybody? I'm the weirdest person in the room. Okay, you do it. There's another person. Oh, that's awesome. Or have you ever, in the middle of the night, try to, find the bathroom without turning on any of the lights, and you're, navigating your house? Yeah. There's this false insecurity that because you've done this path before, then you know where you're going. But I don't know how many times I've gone for a door just to find out that it was open and smacks you right in the face. Or my kids leave Legos out and I'm screaming obscenities in the middle of the night. It's hard to navigate things when it's dark. You bump into things. You step on stuff. And as much as physical darkness can be kind of dangerous, though, the Bible talks about what's known as spiritual darkness. Whereas with physical darkness, you don't really know where you're going. With spiritual darkness, there's a sense of you don't know where your life is headed. Where things can feel kind of meaningless or empty or void. Whereas with physical darkness, you can stumble into things, you can bump into things, you can get hurt. With spiritual darkness, you find yourself running into the same consequences over and over again. The same struggles. You find yourself getting hurt. With physical darkness, there's a sense of you can't see left from right. You don't know where you're supposed to go. But with spiritual darkness, there's a sense in which you don't know what's right and wrong. The line between good and evil is blurred a little bit. You don't know what to do. And where with physical darkness, you might feel like you're alone. You can't see anyone around you. With spiritual darkness, you can feel like God's not there, that he's not with you, because you can't see him. As much as physical darkness is dangerous, spiritual darkness is dangerous as well. And friends, we live in a day and age which has become increasingly spiritually dark, where there's a ton of uncertainty politically, morally, spiritually around us, where that line between good and evil, right and wrong is becoming increasingly blurred. We live in a day and age that is spiritually dark. And as unsettling as that can be for those of us living through it, it's not circumstances that are new to humanity. In fact, they were the very circumstances that some of Jesus' greatest prophecies that he fulfills, promises that he accomplishes, happen. It's in a time of deep spiritual darkness. And so today, that's what we're going to be looking at. For those of you that are just joining us, we're in a series called Fulfilled, in which we've been looking at these prophecies and promises spoken hundreds of years before Jesus came onto the scene, and how Jesus fulfilled those prophecies, and how those prophecies fulfilled so many years ago fulfill us today. And so if you guys have your Bibles, go ahead and open them up, turn them on, swipe or scroll. If you don't have one, feel free to grab one of these paper Bibles. We'll be on page 456. But we're going to be in Matthew chapter 4 today. And to give you a little bit of context, Seth kind of touched on it. Seth, our guest speaker last week, kind of touched on it. Between the Old Testament, the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, and the first book of the New Testament, Matthew, is about 400 years of silence. For some 400 years, it felt like God had kind of left the scene, that he wasn't speaking anymore. And it wasn't just 400 normal years. These were 400 challenging years of significant kind of political upheaval, where there's a ton of uncertainty economically, what was going to happen to God's people. And in the midst of that, you have all these different groups of people that are trying to grapple with that reality. Religious groups, philosophical groups, political groups that were trying to make sense of it. And they kind of arrived at three different conclusions. That maybe the best path forward was to assimilate and become like the Roman world around them. The Jewish people had been overtaken by the Persians and then the Babylonians and then the Romans. And at this point, they're like, this is just kind of our reality. Our best bet is to kind of assimilate. We want to look like the world around us. Then you had some hyper-religious groups like the Pharisees that believe if we double down, if we take this book seriously, then God's going to show us favor. And so they double down on strict laws and restrictions to try and win God back. And then there was another group of people that was banking on the Messiah, that God was going to send someone to bring both spiritual renewal but also political renewal, that he would rescue God's people from the Romans and restore them to a place of prominence. Could you imagine being a person, an everyday person, trying to make sense of that back then? Trying to discern who was right, what you were supposed to do in the midst of this kind of uncertain time. Situations that it's not so much unlike ours today. It was a period of spiritual darkness. In the midst of that, Matthew, one of Jesus' followers, kind of quotes this Old Testament prophecy saying that Jesus is the fulfillment of this prophecy. It's found in Matthew chapter 4, starting in verse 12, where he says this: When Jesus heard that John had been put in prison, he withdrew to Galilee. Leaving Nazareth, he went and lived in Capernaum, which was by the lake in the area of Zebulun and Naphtali, to fulfill what was said through the prophet Isaiah. And this is what was spoken some 700 years before Jesus' feet ever hit the sands of Judea. He says this, the prophet Isaiah: Land of Zebulun and land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people living in darkness have seen a great light, and those living in the land of the shadow of death, the light has dawned. I want to read that last verse one more time. It says, the people living in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, the light has come. In verse 14, we find that the namesake of our series, fulfilled. That word fulfilled comes from the Greek word plerao, which means to fulfill, to make full, to fulfill an obligation, a desire, a dream, a promise. It has this root sense of both fulfilling something that's happening in the present, but also something that had been promised long ago, a desire for a long period of time. And what Matthew is observing is that this is what's happening right there in their midst, is that Jesus is the fulfillment of this prophecy, this promise made some 700 years prior. And what he's acknowledging is he didn't just fulfill this prophecy, but he really was fulfilling a deep hunger that these people had been experiencing for a very long time. A hunger for some good news. A hunger for God to show up in the midst of their spirits. And so that's why he quotes this passage from Isaiah, that the people living in darkness had seen a great light. And those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned. And another point of context that I think is a bit important is Galilee was not the place that you expected God to show up. Galilee was the place of spiritual darkness. Jerusalem was the religious center of the day. That's where God's activity was. That's where the temple was. That's where sacrifices happened. That's where the chief priests and elders were. Galilee was far away from it, and a place that nobody else was expecting. And this was a time in which it seemed like it was darkness. But you see, dawn comes when and where it's darkness. Dawn comes, light shines when and where it feels darkness. You know, one of my favorite things to do while my wife and I lived out in Colorado was to hike this mountain called Goat Mountain. It was about 15 minutes south of Denver. And every Saturday or Sunday, I would go out there. I'd get up there 4 in the morning, way before the sun would rise, and I would hike up this mountain. And on the way up, you'd have to use a headlight to kind of make your way through these switchbacks up to the top. But when I reached the ridge line, that's what I kind of waiting for. Once I got to the top of this mountain, I would just walk. And I'd look out at a valley before me that was completely dark. And then minute by minute, the darkness that was around me would begin to be revealed. Blobs of color, then shapes and form until it was crystal clear all around me. As the sun would rise over the surface and just paint everything around me. And what used to amaze me is that this happens every day. Every day, this incredible moment where the sun rises over when it's darkest and then suddenly it's light. This happens every single day. Built into the framework of creation is this idea that right when things are darkest, dawn comes. I believe that's true of our lives as well. You know, maybe you're here and things have felt a little bit dark, bleak, or things have felt empty or meaningless. Dawn is coming. That is God's promises, right where things feel darkest, right when things feel darkest. The dawn is coming. And that's what Matthew is observing is happening in this passage. Now, that can be a little bit abstract or kind of spiritual. What does that mean that light is coming? And that's where I think a healthy understanding of light and dark is really helpful from a biblical perspective. On its most obvious level, yes, light is good and darkness is bad, but I think there's some nuances that are important to kind of tease out as we talk about light and dark. First is the idea that light represents God's presence. So anywhere in the Bible that God is, there is light. God's presence equals light. And on the flip side of that, when God is absent, that is darkness. So when they're mentioning light and dark, they're talking about God's presence and God's absence. Where there's light, there's light. You can even think to Revelation, where it talks about an entire city being lit up just by God's presence alone. That was God's light. Second is light represents life. Light is one of the prerequisites to life as we understand it. If you think about the beginning of creation when God spoke, one of the first things that he did was he said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Light represents life, vitality, growth. And then on the flip side of that, darkness represents death, decay, loss. And you hear light and dark in Scripture talking about what those things. And then lastly, light represents kind of the clear understanding of good and evil. Whereas darkness represents some confusion about what's right and wrong. Blurriness between good and evil. When we read light, these are kind of the ideas that are baked into that imagery. It's God's presence, it's His life, it's His clarity around good and evil. And on the flip side of that, darkness is God's absence, His loss, the confusion. What Matthew is noting is that This prophecy that had been spoken some 700 years prior was being fulfilled in the person and work of Jesus Christ. That Jesus was light. And if you think about what Jesus was, he was God's presence, literally God with us, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. His name, Emmanuel, means God with us. When Jesus stepped on the stage, it was finally God's light, God's life with us. And Jesus came saying things like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He came offering spiritual life and vitality and healing people physically. And lastly, Jesus came with a crystal clear clarity around what was good and evil, what was right and wrong. Saying things like, you've heard it said that you shouldn't murder someone. But I tell you, you shouldn't be angry with someone. Saying things like, you've heard it say, don't commit adultery, but I tell you, don't look at another person with lustful intent. Jesus ups the ante. He goes right to the condition of our hearts, revealing that right and wrong, good and evil isn't just a matter of outward appearances, but it really has to do with the condition of our heart. Jesus was light in all of those senses. Jesus fulfills that promise that had been promised some 700 years ago. But that being true, if Jesus is all those things, that's a great list on the right side of the page. Why did people in his day have such a problem? Maybe another question is, why do people today have a problem with the way and words of Jesus? If you've been here before, you know we're a little bit of an interactive church. We believe that there's a ton that we can learn from one another. And so what I would love for us to do is spend the next 5 minutes or so at tables kind of discussing that question. Why did people back in Jesus' day have such a problem with Jesus? And on the flip side of that, maybe today, why do people today have such a problem with this? We'll kind of circle back. So you guys have about 5 minutes or so at tables. Chat. All right, go ahead and wrap up your conversations at your tables. Awesome. Well, as beautiful and life-giving as light can be, we talked about some of those things that were on the right side of the board there. God's light, his presence, his clarity around right and wrong. Light can be a little bit uncomfortable when your eyes have been conditioned to the dark. It was a couple years ago that I went through a phase where I wanted to swap out every bulb in my house for LED. I think I had read somewhere that it saves you money or something. They're more expensive on the front end, but you save money long term. So I found myself in that really long aisle of Home Depot with thousands of light bulbs, different sizes, colors. There's bright white, soft light, daylight. I don't know, 60 watt, 100 watt, sure. So as I'm going down the aisle, I'm I want the brightest bulbs I can possibly get. So I got the 100 watt, bright white light bulbs. And there was the next morning as I was kind of waking up and going to the bathroom that I realized why they sell different types of light bulbs. As the solar beams were just striking me in the eye. When your eyes have been conditioned to the dark, bright light can be unsettling. It can be a bit uncomfortable. I think that's what happened with Jesus' life is when you're conditioned to the dark, the ways and words of Jesus can be pretty uncomfortable. They can knock you off. They can feel like those solar beam light bulbs coming at you right after you've spent a night in sleep. And I think for some of us, in living in the world that we are, our eyes have been conditioned to the darkness. Or we've kind of let some things slide. We've allowed ourselves to view things and think about things in ways that we wouldn't have even 5 years ago. Think about some of the shows that we stream on Netflix right now. Good night. Some of the most wildly violent, overly sexualized, disturbing, graphic shows that we just take as normals. We're eating popcorn, a couple hours before we go to bed. There's some shows that we would not have been comfortable watching even 5 years ago, but it's been this kind of slow decline. Every season's trying to up the ante so they can get more viewers. It's pretty startling. Our minds have been conditioned to the dark. So we start reading the Bible and we start hearing kind of the ways and words of Jesus. It can be a bit uncomfortable. You say, I don't know about that. I don't know if I need someone else telling me the way to live or what to do. And I think that's what was happening even in Jesus' day, is that Jesus came as a bright 100-watt, bright white light bulb in a world that had become accustomed to dark. But as uncomfortable as light is, it is so much better than the dark. As uncomfortable as light can be, it is so much better in the dark. I think about my own story. It was around junior year of high school. My parents had done a great job of kind of getting us to church week after week. We attended Catholic Mass every Sunday. It was around junior year of high school that I decided if there was a God, which there probably wasn't, that I was far better at directing my life than he was. And so I just decided to do whatever I wanted to do. I felt like whatever I felt was right was going to be right for me. And that meant partying a ton, messing around with girls, sneaking around, lying constantly. And for a while, it was great. Like it was. I got everything that I wanted. But after a couple of years of living into it, it was dark. I found myself incredibly lonely, incredibly isolated, miserable, and life felt pretty meaningless. And so when I stumbled into a church some 13 years ago, I knew there was no going back to that. Because I'd been there, I had tried that, and what I was looking for wasn't in the darkness. When I stumbled into that church and I found Jesus, I knew that Jesus was so much better than those things. And in the place of that loneliness, I traded that loneliness for a place of belonging. In the place of kind of just feeling like life was meaningless, I found a life full of meaning. And in a not so clear sense of right and wrong, one of my first prayers to Jesus was, God, would you help me to know right from wrong? And very quickly he began showing me what parts of my life, what kind of things I needed to say no to and what. And having experienced that darkness, I can say God is so much better. I don't think that you need kind of a rock bottom moment to come to that conclusion. But for those that have had those kind of rock bottom moments, they can look back and know as uncomfortable as the light can be at first, it is so much better than the dark. So I don't know where you're at this morning. Maybe you're coming in here and life has been a little bit dark. There's some things that you're doing, some things that you never thought you'd struggle with, and you're struggling with some of those things. Or maybe you're here and you would even call yourself a Christian, but if you're to be honest, your life doesn't really look that much different than the world around you. You've let some things slip, some things slide. Your eyes have slowly become accustomed to the darkness. Or maybe you're here and you've been clinging to the light, you've been clinging to what's good, and yet you've been growing weary in the midst of that. And you need God to show up in the midst of your story. And the promise for wherever you're at this morning is some words that Jesus spoke in John chapter 18, where he says, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. So I'm going to invite Julie up to kind of lead us in our last song as she's taking a big old swig of coffee. And as she does, I don't know where you're at today, but maybe a step for you would be choosing to follow Jesus even maybe for the first time. Maybe like me, you've experienced what that darkness is, and you know that it's not found there. Or maybe you're here and you're in a spot where you've let something slide. You're not the person that you thought you would be at this age, and maybe today's an invitation for you to accept Jesus again and to go all in. Whether it's that first time or maybe the 50th time, Jesus' promise then is true today that whoever walks in his light will not walk in the darkness. And so as Julie does this last song, I'm going to lead us in a prayer. You can pray it in your own words and the quiet of your heart. But just kind of an opportunity to go all in for Jesus for the first time. So if you guys would bow your hands with me. And you can kind of maybe speak these words in your own. Jesus, I need you. Your ways and your words are better. I confess that I've made some mistakes. I've messed up. I've been living for myself. And I want to live with and for you. Would you fill me with your Holy Spirit? Would you show me right from wrong? And I want to follow you from this day forevermore.
His name is holy and precious.